The lecture you're about to see was recorded for Aomori orientation for new ALTs arriving on the JET program in 2020. Because of the COVID pandemic, those ALTs were unable to have a standard orientation. I talk a lot about things that are specific to Aomori Prefecture and even more specific to the BOE where I used to work. However, much of the information will be useful for anybody working in a public school setting anywhere in Japan. I hope you enjoy. Hello everyone, my name is Steven Mac Whinnie, and today I'll be giving you a short talk, about an hour, talking about teaching English as a foreign language here in Aomori, Japan. I was an ALT on the JET program for 5 years, and so hopefully I can tell you a bit about what that experience was like, as well as giving you a general idea about how and where English is taught here in Japan. So I'm going to start out by talking a bit about myself, tell you when I came here, that sort of thing. I'll go over the places where English is taught in Japan to kind of explain your place, your part of that process. I'll talk a little bit about approaches and methods, so talking a bit about the theory of teaching English as a foreign language. I'll talk about your role, what you do as an ALT. I'm sure, of course, you already have a good idea about that. I'll talk about how to plan lessons kind of in an idealized way, as well as talking more practically about some of the kind of not so good situations you might have. I also talk a bit about the importance of developing relationships both inside the school and outside the school, and how that really, particularly as an ALT, is a very big part of your job here. And I'll finish by showing you some resources and just going over that. All right, so let's get started with a bit about me. All right, so let me start here by talking a bit about myself. So as I said at the beginning, my name is Steven Mac Whinnie. I'm originally from the state of Maine in the US. I got a bachelor's in history when I was still in America. Before I came here right after graduation. I also have a master's in education in teaching English as a second language. I first visited Japan back in 2005 as an exchange student. I was visiting Risho University, that's in Tokyo. It was a pretty good experience. I really enjoyed it here and decided to come back as a JET after I graduated. And so I was lucky enough to be selected for the JET program in 2007. And I came here in the summer of 2007, did 5 years on the JET program. And I've been here ever since. After JET, I spent some time running a business, an English conversation school. And then about 3 years ago, I was able to get a full-time position where I am now, which is a lecturer in the English department here at Hirosaki Gakuin University. So I've been here in Japan now for over 13 years. Overall, a good experience. Hopefully I'll have a chance to actually meet some of you in person at some point in the future, and perhaps we can talk more. English education in Japan. So now I'm going to talk you through basically where English is taught in Japan. Before coming to Japan, I imagine that you read up on the JET program and also possibly about the general state of English education in the country. So I don't want to spend an awful lot of time on this, but I do want to kind of run through the different places where children learn English. So many children begin learning English in nursery schools and kindergartens. My own experiences also include teaching both at nursery schools and kindergartens. Generally speaking, these sort of classes introduce children to basic English, words, greetings, simple sentences of want. However, while nursery schools and kindergartens can provide a lot of information for small children, they then spend the next several years in elementary school, in most cases without any access to English education. In elementary schools, formalized English education begins, I believe this year, from the 3rd and 4th grade, where you have periods for learning about foreign cultures and foreign languages. Although the course of study includes learning about different countries, in practice these often end up being simply English classes. Then from the 5th and 6th grade, you start to have more formalized English instruction. Now, the elementary school English program, these are all quite new. When I first came here in 2007, there was no formalized English education at the elementary school level. Personally, as a JET, as an ALT, I taught all grades of elementary school, but it was very free-flowing and without any real structure. in, I believe it was my third year, the city, so Aomori City was where I worked as an ALT, the city introduced formalized structured English education, and again this was still simply introducing 5th and 6th graders to kind of foreign culture. So it was a period for learning about foreign cultures, not specifically English, although kind of de facto it ended up being an English course. So after elementary school, children enter junior high school, and it is in junior high school where the really the formalized, rigid education begins. They spend 3 years studying English in junior high schools. They use a set curriculum, they have a set of textbooks they use, and this is very structured. Depending on the grade, there's different numbers of classes, but generally they'll have classes every day of the week or nearly every day of the week. But only, importantly, one kind of general English class. Next, students will go to a variety of senior high schools. If you're teaching in senior high school, you probably have a variety of high schools you visit. In the prefecture, there are many high schools and many different types of high schools. It's important to note that the different type of high school will dictate the level of the students, at least their English level, certainly. If you're working at perhaps the more premier high schools, such as Aomori High School, Hachino High School, Hirosaki High School, you'll have students who generally are better academically, and of course that will translate into better English skills. If you're working at the industrial commercial high schools, you'll have students whose English skills are not as high. Students who are in, for example, Aomori High School or Hachino High School or Hirosaki High School will be university track, and so they may be taking a variety of English classes, such as English classes focused on English expression, English classes focused on English grammar, where you might find that at a commercial high school you only again have a general English class. But generally at the high school level, students will continue on in their English education with at least one topic class about English, and they'll have classes again about every day during the week. So that kind of is where the JET experience stops. Generally speaking, JETs teach from elementary to high school. You may be asked to work in a kindergarten, but that very much depends on your location. When I first came to Japan, I was working in a place that had once been a town, and so I was still asked to teach at the kindergarten, kind of connected to that town. Just to give you more idea about English education in Japan, so of course students who decide to go on to university also have English education courses. I teach in an English department, so of course my students study English for their full 4 years here, but generally speaking, nearly any degree will have at least 1 year of English education. So generally, regardless of what topic the student decides to pursue at the university, they'll have at least 1 year of English education, perhaps more. It very much depends on what their major is, and of course also on what university they decide to go to. So that's kind of the formal schooling. Outside of the formal schooling, we have cram schools. You may have heard about juku, cram schools in Japan. Many students from elementary school, junior high school, and high school go to cram school after regular school. This is to supplement and support the education they receive in the public school systems. There are also English conversation schools, so eikaiwa schools. These are other places for Japanese people to learn English. Some students may go to these schools, although in my experience running one of these schools, it tended to cater more towards adults, but there were students, younger students, who came as well. Okay, so this is just basically the different places in Japan where one might learn English. So as an ALT, you'll be working again in elementary schools, junior high schools, or high schools. So it's important to think about, so how is language actually taught in Japan? So how is it done in Japan? Let me tell you about that next. So in any conversation about how language is taught, it's first important to make the distinction between EFL and ESL. So we'll start with ESL, English as a second language. If you're coming from a country where you have immigrants or refugees or anybody who doesn't speak English as their first language, then they're going to be ESL learners. These are English learners who are learning English in an English-speaking country. And these students have to practice their English with, native, I say native with quotation marks there, with fluent English speakers. And they're exposed to English everywhere. Now this is contrasted with English as a foreign language. That is what you are teaching, okay? So English as a foreign language is the English that is taught in a non-English speaking country, Japan. And students in this situation lack exposure to natural sounding English. They don't have a chance to talk with fluent speakers. They don't have the culture or the historical background surrounding them. And so for EF and EFL students, their only exposure to English language is going to be in class. So that means in your class. This is a very important distinction to remember that the students you are teaching probably are only learning English in the classes that they're taking in school. And so they don't have the cultural exposure, they don't have the historical exposure, and they just don't have the opportunity to practice their English with people around them for the most part. So now I want to talk a little bit about approaches and methods. So when you study education, when you study English language education, either English as a foreign language or English as a second language, you learn a lot about different approaches or methods. So basically different ways to teach. So as my slide says here, basically an approach is a theory and that method is the practice or how you actually do it, right? So you can think of the method being what you actually do in the classroom, and the approach kind of dictates how you do it. So if you're a language teacher, your approach might be communicative, and then as a way to actually do that in the classroom, your method might be task-based. For example, if you go on YouTube and look up any of these approaches or methods, you'll find many videos introducing how to do it and what to do it. Just as some examples, here on the left side of the slide, you can see something like audiolingual. This is the recordings, visuals, language labs. We have total physical response. This is popular particularly with younger children. This is using gestures, moving around, really using the whole body, hence the total physical response. There's things like silent method, which has to do with color coding. Community language teaching, this is more organic. You develop materials as they're needed. There's a natural approach, which is with Aurelia, so using real objects in the classroom. Sesotopia, so again, recordings, literary text, classroom fixtures, music. And what I try to do, which is on the very bottom there, which is communicative language teaching, which is to introduce authentic materials to try to get the students using materials that they might actually run into in life, and also to actualize that with task-based materials rather than doing a kind of a repeat after me exercise, having the students do a sort of task. So telling them, okay, you're going to create something using English. So these are just kind of several of the approaches or methods that can be used for teaching. And it's very interesting to read about these, to learn about these, and I would recommend, if you have time, particularly coming up into the spring break, we'll, I think, have a lot of downtime. So take that time and really try to learn about these. For any of you who are interested in guidance on what you should read, what you should look at, I'll have a list of references at the end of this, but you're also welcome to contact me personally, and I can talk to you about any of these and certainly suggest different places to learn more about them. Okay, so this is just a kind of general overview of some methods, some approaches that exist in teaching. So let's talk more about Japan specifically. So in Japan, we have kind of an unfortunate historical hangover, which is the grammar translation method. So in Japan, English education began arguably in the 1600s, and kind of the earliest or the earlier English education was done using the grammar translation method. Now, if any of you studied Latin or ancient Greek at school, you might be familiar with this method. Basically, this is a method where students look at text in one language and then translate it into their own language. And they note the different grammatical conventions and how that translation takes place. So, if you studied Latin in school, then you probably took Latin texts and translated them into English. And unfortunately, this was the way that English was taught in Japan for quite a long time, and there's still quite a strong influence of this method in junior high schools and high schools. Elementary schools, not so much, because that's more communicative-based language learning. But because of this holdover, you may find that many classrooms that you visit still really rely on the translation of the textbook into Japanese or Japanese sentences into English. Hopefully not. Things are changing. The Ministry of Education is very much against this teaching method and is really trying to move English education in Japan as a whole forward, trying to encourage more communicative-based teaching, that is to get the students using English in more realistic and practical matters. If you encounter this, it's unfortunate, but you have to just do your best to work within that system. And I introduce this here just as perhaps a warning that you may find this method being used in your classrooms. And although not ideal, it can be just the reality of the situation. But as an ALT, hopefully you won't be engaging in this method. Hopefully you'll be trying to bring the actual language use, so communication, so speaking to your classroom. But again, this is perhaps the reality in some places, and you'll have to adapt and learn how to work within these sort of classrooms and try to find ways to bring your unique take, your skills as an English speaker to help students move beyond this method. And I simply mention this just again as kind of a warning that this sort of thing still does happen here in Japan. So now I've talked a little bit about different methods, different approaches to teaching. So what should you do as an ALT? Now, I imagine that there has probably been literature and some talk about what you actually do as an ALT. So let me just talk about that for a bit now. So you may have heard the old stereotype that ALTs come in and simply act as a tape recorder, although now I suppose you act as a CD player. Unfortunately, this does still happen, less and less. In my time as an ALT over the 5 years, when I came, it happened much more than it did 5 years later when I finished. You may still have this happen, where essentially, instead of the JTE using a CD to have the students listen to some conversation or speech, they simply ask the ALT to read it. This is really not good. And if at all possible, you should try to avoid becoming simply the tape recorder. However, you also shouldn't pick a fight with your JT about this. Perhaps you might consider your role to be something like a cheerleader, where you come in and cheer the students on and encourage them to use English. Well, I would say that for some situations, the ALT should cheer for the students. I certainly worked very hard to try to create a positive image of English and of English speakers when I was working, particularly in elementary school, trying to show the students that yes, you can use English in a practical way, and that there are people you want to speak to in English. But again, if you're simply the cheerleader, perhaps you won't be a very effective teacher. There's also perhaps the role of foreign friend. Maybe you're coming into a senior high school and you're chatting with the students and trying to build some relationships. Again, this isn't necessarily bad, but do be careful. Remember that while you might be friendly with the students, they are your students and your teacher, and so you're not going to be wanting to say, hey, let's go hang out on the weekend or something like that. But again, I think being friendly is important. Being a scary teacher is perhaps going to create a negative image of the language as a whole. Remember, you are an ambassador from the land of English. And so being friendly is certainly one part of your role. Okay, perhaps you're a fun teacher. When you come in, you play games. This can certainly be the case in many situations where when the ALT comes to school, that means the students are going to have a fun class where they don't learn but simply play games. Again, there's some danger in this where the idea becomes that the JT's classes are boring, where students have to concentrate and study English, and the ALT's lessons are fun lessons where you just play silly games and enjoy yourself. Again, this is a trap to fall into. Of course, ideally you're going to create a very positive classroom environment, which are fun, but at the same time you have to be careful that the students take you seriously, right? And they don't just view your lessons as being kind of a fun break from the real learning, as it were. Perhaps you're the real teacher. Particularly for some ALTs in senior high school, you may find that you are responsible for teaching the classroom essentially, teaching class essentially alone, and that you are the teacher, the only teacher. There's some problems with this, particularly if you are not a licensed teacher, to be suddenly tossed in a situation where you have to be the real teacher. But it certainly happens, perhaps not ideal. So ideally, as I've said here, you are the assistant language teacher, hence your title, ALTs. And that means that you're team teaching, you're working with a JTE, and sure, perhaps you're reading out some text to create a model of what it should sound like. So perhaps in some cases you are a bit tape recorder. The students need to hear what fluent English sounds like. And perhaps you are a bit cheerleader, right? You're encouraging them to speak and to use their English. And perhaps you are a bit foreign friend. You're being friendly with the students and you're trying to encourage them to use English. And perhaps you are fun, right? So if you're team teaching, you're with your JTE there, perhaps you're having fun working together to create an enjoyable educational lesson. And yes, you are a real teacher, right? You're not simply there to make funny faces. You're there to make sure the students are engaging in English education, engaging in their learning. Let's talk about lesson planning. So I'm going to talk about kind of the ideal idea for lesson planning. Your reality in your schools will probably be very, very different. Possibly it'll be like this, but let's talk about overall the lesson planning process. So if you're planning a lesson, you'll probably be planning it based on some page from the textbook. The picture here is an example from a junior high school first year textbook. Hopefully your BOE will give you copies of these textbooks. If they haven't, I do recommend asking for them. Looking through them, you can see the progression in skills, progression in vocabulary, and progression of grammar. So when you're planning your lesson, it's going to be very important to see where you are in the curriculum. Okay, so if you're teaching, for example, this page, you can see that it's some pages into the textbook. So the students are going to have some grammar and vocabulary that they have previously learned. So when you look at this page and think, okay, how am I going to teach this? Well, first off, you have to set some reasonable, achievable goals for the lesson or the part of the lesson you're going to teach. So at this particular page, you can see that there is at the bottom of the page on the right, this example, this is. So you might think, okay, in this lesson today, I'm going to teach the students how to use the phrase, this is for things near me, right? So you want to have a very achievable, very specific goal going into the lesson. Next, you're going to want to account for your students' level and prepare accordingly. Again, if you have the textbooks handy, it's very useful to know how far the students are in the textbook and to know yourself what grammar and what vocabulary the students should already know. So you're going to want to come in and you're going to want to plan accordingly. And when I say plan accordingly, I mean that if you are trying to teach them something, you need to make sure that your explanation and any English that you want them to use is going to be English that they already know, or is the very specific goal or new English that you have set for them. A very common mistake for ALTs is to walk into a classroom and think, okay, I want to teach this point, and then use a whole ton of new grammar and new vocabulary to try to teach that one small point. This doesn't work very well. And perhaps if you're a very good teacher, you might be able to make it work, but generally you should avoid that. So you should be using the grammar and the vocabulary that the students already used to explain that new point. That being said, of course, as the next point says, you're going to be planning or consulting with your JTE. And so your JTE may be able to say, okay, so if you want to do this activity or have them do this task, maybe they don't know these certain bits, so let me, as the JTE, explain that to them in Japanese. I wouldn't say that that's bad. Again, this is perhaps a personal preference. For me, I had no problem with that as an ALT, but I learned, again, I spent 5 years in the JET program, that this wasn't really good, and that if the JT is spending too much time to explain what you want the students to do in Japanese, then basically you've done a bad job as an ALT preparing for the lesson. Your lessons may need some explanation from the JT in Japanese, but if your JT is spending, an inordinate amount of time explaining, then probably it's a bad plan. Okay, so you're coming into this lesson, you've looked at the page you're teaching that day, you've looked at the specific grammar point or the specific set of vocabulary words you want to teach. Okay, check. You've thought about how you're going to introduce what you want the students to do. You've looked back at what the students already know, and you're going to use the same grammar and the same vocabulary to introduce what you want the students to do. Okay, check. Of course, you've talked with your JTE, and you've showed the JTE your plan, and you've discussed how you're going to do it. You've talked about your role, what you're going to explain, what you're going to ask the students to do, and you've also asked the JTE to perhaps explain difficult points. Okay, so you got that far. Then, of course, you're going to go to class and you're going to start teaching. Well, some problems are definitely going to come up. So that comes to the next point. You should have an arsenal of easily adaptable, can use anywhere, anytime activities. Because sometimes there just won't be any time to prepare things, right? So you come in and you have some idea. Perhaps it works, but the students finish really quickly. Or perhaps it doesn't work, and so you have to throw out that idea and do something different. So there are many, many different activities and kind of games, I guess, I'd say tasks, that you can have students do to learn, any sort of grammar point, any sort of vocabulary point, and as you spend more time here as an ALT, you'll learn more and more of them. And again, I'll have some references listed at the end of this presentation, and of course, as before, you're welcome to talk to me, talk to any of the other ALTs who are still here about what they do, what sort of games and activities they do, and then really think about how you could adapt those to different situations, different grammar points, different vocabulary points. Okay, so you're going to have some problems, you're going to have some things go well. Well, that brings us to the next point, which is to anticipate problems and be ready if they appear. And if they don't, try to understand why they didn't. So basically, if you have a bad lesson, and it happened to me many, many times, and it still happens to me as a language teacher, so be prepared to think, okay, what didn't work and why didn't it work? And I still do this now, teaching at university level. I still have lessons that don't work well, and after the lesson I always have some notes in my lesson plan, and I have to think, okay, so next year when I teach this content, how can I change it? As an ALT, perhaps you're lucky because you might be teaching similar lessons across a variety of schools over a week, and so perhaps you might use the same lesson a dozen times, and so every time you teach it, if there are problems, you can think, okay, next time, what do I change? At the same time, perhaps you go to a school and it works great, and that's wonderful and it feels great. Well, why did it work? What did you do? What language did you use? How did you approach the topic? How did you talk with your JTE before class? What did you do that made it work? And so that brings us to the final point here, which is to reflect on success and reflect on your failures. This is really important. So we say reflexive language teaching. So every time you have a lesson, you can think afterwards, okay, what went well? What went wrong? So just as a kind of as a note, you can look this up, and there are log sheets you can download to really record kind of the minute details, the small details about what goes well and what goes wrong. I'd recommend doing it perhaps at least once. Every time is perhaps overkill, but this is also a very interesting topic. If you're interested, again, at the end of this presentation, I'll have some references up. But to think, every time you teach, whether it goes good or bad, what went well and why, what didn't go well and why, and really reflect on that and think, okay, How can I improve on my skills as a teacher? And it might be that the class itself went well, but you might notice that your JTE is not participating well. Okay, so the teaching itself was fine, but perhaps your relationship with the JTE was affected because of something you did in class. So going forward, what can you do to change how you approach that situation and how you interact with the JTE? Okay, so this is perhaps the ideal of lesson planning. So let's talk about some possible situations that might arise. So one problem that you might run into is having no meeting time with your JTE before you have class. This is particularly true if you are based at your BOE's office and you travel to different schools to do lessons. If you're kind of based permanently at a school, this might not be a problem. I worked in Aomori City, as I mentioned before, and I went to a variety of elementary schools and junior high schools. During my time as an ALT, I visited like 50. So it wasn't that uncommon to have no meeting time. Sometimes this was simply because the JTE didn't have time, or it might be because in order to get to that school, I had to take a certain series of buses or trains, and I simply would arrive with no time to plan. So what do you do? Well, first off, you'll probably be given a lesson plan. This might be a good lesson plan, it might be a bad lesson plan. So take the time to read through it. It may be in Japanese. Well, if you have a phone, you got Google Translate. There's a great photo camera option that allows you to translate written text. So figure it out. There's really no excuse in this day and age to not read through the lesson plan. Particularly pay attention to if there are columns or some indication of separation of roles. So try to figure out what it is that the lesson plan wants you to do. If you're at a BOE with other ALTs, you can ask the ALTs who've been here longer to help you read it, to help you figure out what it says. But again, the lesson plan should be your first thing to go to. If the lesson plan is vague or you can't figure it out, you should at least be able to figure out where you are in the textbook or what topic is being discussed. And so it's really good to have an activity or two just in case. In the worst case, you should have an activity that can take a good portion of the class time just in case. One thing I would say is, though, don't be disappointed. It can be the case you get a lesson plan, it's kind of vague, and so you think, okay, I better prepare an activity or two, and you do that, and you go, and the JT already has everything planned, and you don't get to do anything you prepared. So try not to get, don't get too, too invested, I suppose, but do take the time to review the lesson plan. Ultimately, I would say, though, stay positive. If you come in and you're complaining or whatever, it's gonna kind of sour your relationship with that JT. But do ask, after the lesson, and ask the JT about when they might have time to talk about the next class. And in my personal experience, I found that some JTs are pretty happy to say, yeah, okay, let's figure out when to meet to discuss this. But about half will say, sorry, just there's no time, so, please review the lesson plan. Or they might give you more responsibility and say, okay, so next time we have to teach, for example, chapter 5, so please prepare a lesson about chapter 5. But it does vary a lot. You may find that, particularly if you're in junior high school, the JTEs just don't have time to meet and talk, particularly if they're in charge of a bukatsu, after-school activity that is quite busy. But again, try again. Elementary school teachers often will have time in the early mornings. I used to show up to elementary schools at like 7 in the morning before morning meeting to try to catch the teachers before class so we could talk things through. This again is very situational. You may find that your schools don't want you there early, or you may find that you're asked to come at specific times. But again, if you're not having time to meet, talk to the teachers about it. Try to figure it out. I remember one of my elementary schools, they were very bad about scheduling starts because I arrived just like 5 minutes before lessons began because of buses and trains and kind of that sort of thing. And so when I finally got a chance to talk to the JT and say, look, this is maybe not the best situation, the JT said, oh yeah, actually, I have the full year of lesson plans already ready, so I can just show you the next week or the next month's plan now, and we can talk about it. And we spent the afternoon kind of cleaning time, just very quickly going over the sort of lessons that we'd be doing for the rest of the year working together. Another situation you might run into is no lesson plans at all, or suddenly being asked to teach. So first thing what to do, don't panic. This would happen, or occasionally I would get to a school and the JT, or in the case of elementary schools, the head, the classroom teacher would simply say, okay, please teach them English, and then walk to the back and sit down. So first off, don't panic. Know where the students are in the textbook. If it's elementary school, the textbooks are designed to be very good for playing lots and lots of different interesting games. Junior high school, again, you will hopefully have copies of the textbooks and have already read through them completely and have an idea about what sort of activities or what sort of things might go with what section. But always have some activities ready kind of in the back of your pocket. You may find that even in junior high school you can adapt games that you might think are too juvenile. If you know something like karuta, or like anything requiring janken, so if you don't know, ask your senpai, ask other ALTs about those. Those sort of games can be often adapted really for any age group, and if you can figure out how to integrate English well into those, they can be effective teaching methods without so much preparation. But again, don't panic, do your best. Usually in these situations the students are looking forward to ALT coming, at least in my personal experience. But if you have some things prepared just always to carry with you, it can be really, really good. Also, do remind the JTE or whoever's in charge of you at that school that you do need to plan before classes. If they're not going to provide a lesson plan, then you need to have some sort of communication about what should be taught. So you're not just showing up to teach some random English to some random students. That's not good. There are courses of study, there are curriculums that are in place, the government decides them. And so there is a course of study that the student should be following. And so there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to, before class, find out where they are and hopefully be able to plan something that is relevant to where they are in their education. Okay, so perhaps one of the worst, and for me was the most boring experiences, was when your tape recorder. This can sneak up unexpectedly. You might have a great lesson plan and have a good meeting with the JTE, and it might seem like you're going to have a very interesting class, only to arrive and it turn out that you are essentially a tape recorder. So first off, do your best. Try not to be too disappointed or look too bored. Again, this is not really ideal, and so you might try to talk gently with your JTE about this and try to say, hey, I can do more, we can do activities. And you might find the JTE just kind of brushes you off. I found in most cases where I tried to talk to JTEs about using me as a tape recorder, the excuse generally was, oh, sorry, we have to cover this content, so we don't have time to do games or whatnot. And this is a very, very unfortunate image that remains of the ALT. Again, I talked about roles before as just being the fun teacher who doesn't actually teach any content. And there are some JTEs who have this very, very strong image of the ALT as only that sort of person. And so I'd say, if you can, do your best to try to change that. So personally in those classes, I would be the tape recorder, and then I'd walk around and I would try to help the students who are struggling, make myself somewhat useful. These classes are very difficult. But again, do try to talk to your JT. You might also talk to the person in charge of ALTs in your BOE if it's really a problem. Again, also talk to other ALTs who have worked with that same teacher, see if it's a common thing. Ultimately, kind of my advice would be, in the end, this is your job. And if that is what's requested of you and you can't get the JT to change, then just do it. Because again, you're paid for this, so kind of have to, but it's not the ideal. And I would say, if at all possible, try to figure out some other way to approach that class so that you're not simply being the tape recorder. Okay, so we've looked at methods and approaches to teaching. We've talked about how to develop a lesson plan generally. We've talked about a couple problems you might have and some ideas for solutions to them. So now I want to move on to what I think is perhaps one of the most important aspects of your job. That is the relationships you build while you're here. Now, this talk is all about teaching English as a foreign language in Japan. That being said, as an ALT, you're coming here as an assistant language teacher, but you're also coming here to a certain extent as a representative of both your country and gaikoku, that is, foreigners in general. And so the relationships you build while you're here reflect not only on you, but also on other foreigners and your entire country. Again, I've been here quite a long time now, and where I work now, my university actually trains teachers, trains JTEs. And while I was in ALT, I made many friends with JTEs. And so I think, although I don't have a Japanese perspective, I have a bit of an inside-outside perspective on these relationships. So I want to talk now about the different sorts of relationships that you'll probably have while you're here, and just kind of some things you should probably pay attention to as they happen. So when you arrive here, you're already here, one of the first places you'll go, the first people you'll meet will be your Board of Education. If you're in a small town, your Board of Education may be almost, in the midst of your schools, or if you're in a larger city, it may be quite a ways away from where you actually teach. In your BOE, you're going to have relationships with supervisors, with other ALTs if you're in a larger area. And it's very important to maintain a good relationship with these people. They're going to be helping you a lot, but keep in mind that in the case of your supervisor, although they're very friendly, they're also your boss, and so it's very important to maintain a good relationship. That being said, if you're having a problem with work-related things, please do talk to them. As a teacher, if you're having a hard time with something to do with around the teaching your teaching environment, this could be other relationships with the coworkers or with the JTEs, that's going to affect your ability to actually teach effectively. And so your supervisor at your BOE would be the person to talk to about that. Perhaps not about problems you have romantically or that side of things, but related to kind of the work world. They're going to be your best resource and a very important person to talk with. Okay, next you're also going to have relationships with your schools, with different schools. Some of you may be based only at one school, although most of you will visit several, and you'll find that at your school there are different people who you will have contact with. I imagine that your BOE will probably explain how to do a school visit, such as who you should greet, like the principal and whatnot. So within your school, you'll find that there are a variety of different teachers, some of who are friendly, some of who are not friendly, and you'll find that there are teachers who are not your JTEs, who teach other subjects, who want to talk to you, who want to be friendly. I definitely recommend that. I learned an awful lot about Japan when I first came here by making friends with the Japanese language teachers. They couldn't speak all that much English, and so I stumbled through with my Japanese, but it was really a very good experience. And I also spent a lot of time with the teachers of special education, so working with disabled students. This is a very, very good chance to learn also about how the Japanese education system works by talking to teachers who are not just JTEs. So if you're at a school for any period of time, it's very helpful to understand kind of the school culture, how things work. You also have relationships with your coworkers, and I should probably say foreign coworkers, other ALTs, whether this might be in your office or just in the ALT community. This is also something, again, you should be very careful with. You want to try to maintain, pleasant relationships with them, particularly with other ALTs who might be able to help you if you're having problems in the classroom, right? It's really very helpful to be able to talk about lessons that work or don't work, or perhaps if you need some ideas about how to actually teach things. You might notice that in this presentation I've kind of steered away from actually discussing any specific activity, and this is really because that your situation, even though you're in the prefecture in one specific area, your experience as an ALT is going to be really, really different depending on where your BOE is and what schools you go to. And so activities that were very good for me might not work for you. I think they'd work in Aomori City where I was an ALT, but they might not work where you are. Okay, the other big place that's really important is relationships with JTEs. Now, I've also lumped in the elementary school homeroom teachers here. So if you're in senior high school, you're probably going to find that your JTEs speak pretty good English. You're probably going to be able to have your meetings mostly in English, be able to communicate well, talk about what you want to do. This might not be the case in junior high school, and almost certainly won't be the case in elementary school. And so I imagine in orientation somewhere, someone has mentioned learning Japanese. I can't stress this enough. If you're here for any amount of time, you should learn Japanese. Basically, that's all there is to it. Particularly if you want to develop good relationships with JTEs, particularly in elementary school, but junior high school as well. And your JTE is going to be the person who really can help you, because for the most part, JTEs have had a lot of experience working with many different ALTs, and they're going to have an idea about the role of ALTs and what they want ALTs to do in the classroom. But they're also going to be a bit nervous to meet you in the beginning, and they're perhaps not going to feel comfortable telling you what they really want you to do. And so it's really good if you can develop a very friendly relationship with your JTEs, where you can very, openly say, okay, what do you want me to do? Or what should I do here? Or do you want me to, make an activity for this? Or do you want me to teach this? Do you want me to explain this? And to be able to ask those things. Again, ideally, at least in my experience, is being able to ask those things in English or in Japanese. And that can be a challenge if you're trying to have a meeting in the 5 minutes you have before your JT has to run off, and you're trying to discuss with the JT if the JT wants you to teach some grammar point. It can be very hard to talk about that, particularly if you're doing it in Japanese versus English. But really, those conversations, whenever you can have them, are really very important. Even now, I have several JTs who I consider to be quite good friends and who I keep in touch with. But remember, JTs, they're going to see you for a very short time, but they are very busy. And so if your JT appears to have a lot of time, it's certainly fine to talk with them about other things. But do note that they're going to be busy planning and grading and probably also being in charge of club activities. And so they might not really have an awful lot of time to just kind of hang out and talk with you. But still, developing those relationships with good communication is really perhaps the most important relationship you'll have as a teacher here. You also will need to develop your relationships with your students and to try to figure out how you see yourself as a teacher and how you envision your relationship between yourself and the students. So I talked about the role of ALTs earlier, and in that I kind of hinted at this idea about kind of your role as an ALT with regards to the students. Now, this is perhaps a bit difficult to address, particularly because it involves not only the actual behaviors and actions of you with the students, but the behaviors of the JTE or the school principal or your supervisor towards you in front of students. Now, personally, I didn't really care either way, but you might find that people address you with san. It's the equivalent, what would be like a Mr. or Miss, perhaps. And you'll find that some people address you with sensei, meaning teacher. Some ALTs, this bothers a lot. For me personally, I didn't really care either way, but it does impact the way that students view you. So if you talk about yourself, do you talk about yourself just with your first name? So I just say, hi, my name is Steven. Or when you refer to yourself, do you add on a sensei to the end? It's not particularly weird to do that, although personally when I was in ALT, I thought they're quite strange. After finishing JET at a university, for sure, I tend to add the suffix if I'm talking about myself, particularly in Japanese, in front of students. So you're going to want to figure out how much friend versus how much teacher, how much fun versus how much seriousness you want to show with your students. And this might be something that is consistent across all the schools you teach at, and it might be something that is very variable from school to school, or even from grade to grade. Particularly in elementary school, I found that at some of my schools that I visited, I ended up being put basically in charge of the entire class. The teacher would come in and say, okay, the ALT's here today for a lesson, turn to me and say, yoroshiku onegaishimasu, and then sit in the back. And in those cases, I was the teacher, and so I needed to make sure the students respected me less as the fun ALT and more as the serious teacher who was actually teaching the content and the subject. And so in those situations, I was most certainly Steven Sensei, and I was most certainly there to teach in perhaps a more serious manner. That being said, at other elementary schools, I think of one school which had a very good English language teacher. Her hobby was English, and so she was quite good at the language. And so she worked very hard to make the lessons very engaging for the students. And so when I came into class, she integrated me very well in the lessons. I had things to do. We worked together very well, but she was really the driving force in those lessons. And so in those cases, I was much more the fun extra person, right? So I took on more of a role as like, let's say, an older brother who came to play with the younger students, enjoying the lesson and working together. And so this is something that's very important to think about, and I would suggest that as you are, feeling out your schools and starting to develop your relationships, to try to think about how you want to be viewed by the students and also, by other people, in the schools and in your BOE. To a certain extent, you can't control everything, and it can be kind of weird if you make a big stink about being addressed one way or the other. But how you hold yourself, if you're talking to students, if you're in high schools, are you joking with the students as if you're a high school student? Well, if you do that, the JT is going to probably view you much like a student and less like a coworker. But again, these are all small, small behaviors, small decisions that you make. They will have an impact. I imagine you've probably been told before, but remember, as a foreigner, you really stand out. And so anything you do in any situation will be noticed by people around you. Some ALTs really hate this, some ALTs really love this. It is unfortunately the reality of the situation. And so how you behave around students will be noticed. Okay, and so that brings us to the final area, which is relationships with the community. This, of course, is a person-by-person thing, but do remember that, as I just said, your actions will be noticed by everybody. And so this means that how you behave in your neighborhood, how you behave when you go out with your friends at night, these sort of things will be noticed, and word of what you do will probably get back to your BOE or perhaps even to your students. Where we are here in Aomori Prefecture, it's quite a small prefecture. And so, if you go to some restaurant, it's quite possible that the people running it or your waitress has kids or a brother or a sister that is in the school you're teaching at. So remember, you're a teacher in the school, but also to a certain extent outside the school. I'm not trying to say, don't live your life, live in horror. That's not the point. The point is simply that you have to think of yourself, particularly living in Japan as a foreigner, as being an educator kind of all the time. You can relax, of course, but just keep in mind that there's going to be some image that you project within your community. Again, this of course is a personal choice how you want to address this, but I think it's just notable to note kind of the reality of the situation. Perhaps it's not ideal, but it is simply the way things are. Again, talk with other ALTs, they might be able to help you with this. Occasionally you'll find a JTE, particularly a JTE, who is very good at English and who is willing to talk to you and perhaps offer guidance. Again, it really depends on your situation. But if you're ever unsure, certainly talk to other ALTs. If you don't have any other ALTs in your BOE, you're always welcome to try to reach out to your prefectural advisors, who are also there to help you. So I'll finish this by talking about some resources and then finally wrapping up a bit. Through the course of this lecture, this talk, I've mentioned a couple places, but I haven't mentioned what I think is perhaps the best resource for new ALTs. That is on the top of the list here. That is ALT Training Online, ALTTO Online. This is an invaluable resource. I've contributed to some of their modules, some of their blog posts, but really, absolutely, go to this website, ALTTO.net, and then look at their courses and go through and read through and do all of their activities. They have in-depth tutorials, in-depth information about how to teach really everything and anything. They have in-depth information about what it's like to actually work in a school. Really, this is kind of the online training guide that I wish that I had had when I came as an ALT all those years ago. So particularly now coming into the spring vacation, take the time and go through this. It shouldn't take you more than about a week if you do it every day, and go through it. They also have a great online presence. They've got a good Facebook group where you can ask questions, get answers. I actually posted and asked what ALTs might have wanted to know for this lecture, but definitely please do check that out. I also mentioned reflective teaching. That is when you teach and how you review and how you think about and reflect on what you've done in class, what has worked, what hasn't worked. Excuse me. This is a good book. It goes through and explains kind of all of the different things you can consider. It's definitely worth reading. If you have a bit of spare cash to buy it. If you're looking for ideas for lessons, how to actually teach in the classroom. New Ways in Teaching Speaking by TESOL Press. They've got a new edition I contributed to that came out just beginning of 2020. It's just full of activities, many of which can be adapted. It's quite pricey, so I'm not sure if you actually want to buy it. If you're interested in looking at it, send me an email. I can hook you up with that. And then finally, take a look at the next new course of study. They have online, in English, information about all of the courses of study for elementary, junior high school, actually in kindergarten as well. If you're not teaching actively, it might be hard to understand, but it is all there. And so, quite honestly, I recommend start teaching for a bit, perhaps starting in the new year from April, teach through till the summer vacation, and then go back and read this, because it'll make a lot more sense once you actually have some experience in the classroom. But it's very useful to see kind of structurally how the government has kind of built this structure up to provide English education here in Japan. Okay, so this wraps up my lecture. Hopefully I've been able to give you a good idea about teaching English as a foreign language here in Japan. If you have any questions, unfortunately this year, because this is just a video for you to watch, there's not much you can actually ask, but do feel free to email me. Hopefully by summer we can get some vaccines in place and be over the pandemic enough to actually be able to meet in person. And I hope to see many of you in one of the summer festivals. Again, thank you for taking the time to listen to this, and I'd be very happy to talk to you about any of the things I mentioned or anything to do with being an ALT here in Aomori, either by email or in person once we can meet again. Thank you very much.